In this game, the great tactician Leonid Stein gives a masterclass in creating a sudden counterplay in a seemingly passive position. First, he sacrifices a pawn to open a file for his rook. Then he sacrifices the second pawn to open a diagonal for his light-squared bishop. But his dark-squared bishop is still passive, so the sacrifice of the third pawn follows. As a result, his opponent, Viktor Korchnoi, is 3 pawns up, but Stein's pieces are much more active and create total chaos on the chessboard. Korchnoi starts with d4. And Stein plays his favorite King's Indian defense. Knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4, d6. Korchnoi opts for Zemish attack, f3. The idea is to create the bishop and queen battery, castle queenside, and start the pawn storm on the kingside. Stein castles kingside, bishop e3, e5, and Korchnoi crosses the center of the board, closing the center and grabbing space in the center and on the queenside. Stein makes a standard King's Indian move, knight h5, unblocking his f-pawn and preparing f5 in order to start the counterplay on the kingside. Queen d2, preparing the long castle, f5, long castle. Stein develops his knight, knight d7, Korchnoi does the same, developing his bishop, bishop d3, and Stein exchanges on e4. Korchnoi captures with his knight, getting a great blockading square on e4 for his pieces. Stein plays knight f4, attacking the valuable bishop. Korchnoi wants to retain the bishop pair, of course, so the bishop retreats to c2. And Stein plays knight f6, offering the exchange of the knights. And as white has the space advantage, Korchnoi decided to refrain from the exchange, so he wants to keep as many pieces on board as possible. Knight c3. Also, the knight controls the important b5 square. As white king has castled queenside, the natural way to get the counterplay for black is to prepare b5. By playing a6 and b5, black must try to open the files on the queenside. But Stein plays much sharper. He plays b5 immediately, sacrificing the pawn in order to open the b file for his rook. In case white captures with the pawn, black will play a6 and get a very good counterplay, as it would lead to the opening of the more files on the queenside. That's why Korchnoi captures with the knight, and bishop a6 followed, creating an immediate threat, namely knight takes d5, and after c takes d, the knight would be unguarded and the bishop would simply capture it. In case white plays a4, defending the knight, black would simply capture, and after a takes b, again black would play a6 with a very good counterplay. In case the knight retreats to c3, to the natural square, the c4 pawn would fall. That's why, after bishop a6, Korchnoi retreats his knight to a3, so that the knight defends the pawn, but the knight is passively placed on the edge of the board. Of course, Stein plays rook b8, activating his rook. The rook is attacking b2, which is currently defended by the king. Korchnoi kicks the knight out, g3, and knight h5 followed. Now Stein can play e4 at any moment, opening his dark-squared bishop's diagonal, after which the bishop would coordinate with the rook very well, and the b2 pawn would be a target of attack. That's why Korchnoi takes measures against it. b3. The bishop has completed its mission on a6, so Stein moves it to b7, to the long diagonal. As white's light-squared bishop has left the king side and is currently placed on the queen side, the light squares on the king side are weakened, and the bishop on b7 is quite effective. At the moment, it's closed, of course, the diagonal is closed by the d5 pawn, but Stein will solve this problem. Korchnoi, of course, plays now knight b1, which looks like the most natural move, because the knight isn't doing anything on the edge of the board, so it moves to b1, and probably Korchnoi is going to activate it via c3 later in the game. And Stein plays c6 in order to open the diagonal for his light-squared bishop, sacrificing the second pawn, because after d takes c, bishop takes c6, of course, the backward d6 pawn falls immediately. Queen takes d6. Now white is 2 pawns up, also attacking the bishop and the pawn. Stein plays queen e8, defending his bishop. Korchnoi moves his rook to the e file, so that after the retreat of the bishop, the rook, together with the queen, will attack the pawn. Rook f7 followed, and of course bishop d2. Now white is threatening to capture the pawn, and the natural move for black would have been rook e7, of course. But Stein plays this game as sharp as possible. He leaves his pawn unguarded and attacks the queen, bishop f8. And it seems that the best move for white, although it looks dangerous at first sight, would have been to capture on e5, accepting the sacrifice of the third pawn. It looks dangerous because black would have played rook e7, attacking the queen, and also after the queen retreats from e5, the rook on e1 would be under attack. It would be attacked by both the queen and the rook, and it's defended only once by the bishop. For example, if the queen retreats to c3 in order to defend the rook, black would simply exchange on e1 and play bishop b4. And the queen cannot retreat because the e1 bishop would fall, and white would be forced to give up his queen after queen takes b4, rook takes b4, and bishop takes b4. But instead of queen c3 after rook e7, white had a stronger move, queen a5. And in this case, after rook takes e1, bishop takes e1, black cannot play bishop b4 anymore. So in this position, white would be up 3 pawns, and it isn't clear if black has enough compensation. Of course, black has some compensation. Black pieces are much more active, while white pieces are passively placed. White has problems in finishing the development of the king side, because as soon as the g1 knight moves, the f3 pawn would fall, but still it isn't clear that this compensation is enough, because 3 pawns is quite serious. The c4 pawn is very strong, for example, controlling the important squares. So Korchnoi had to, after bishop f8, capture the pawn on e5. But he didn't want to risk. Most probably he thought that 2 pawns, he's already 2 pawns up, so there is no need to risk further. So he decided to retreat his queen to d3. And as the pawn has survived, Stein immediately pushes it further, e4, attacking the queen, removing the pawn from e5. That means the long diagonal for the dark squared bishop is open, and by playing bishop g7, Stein will have a chance to activate his dark squared bishop. Also, by playing e4, Stein weakens the long diagonal even more, and his light squared bishop becomes even stronger. e4 is actually the sacrifice, again, the sacrifice of the third pawn. But in case white captures the pawn, black can either play immediately knight g4, and there is no way white can prevent the invasion of the knight to f2, after which black would get the exchange for 3 pawns, or probably even stronger than immediate knight g4 would have been rook d8, attacking the queen, and after the queen retreats, sacrificing the exchange. And in this case, white cannot capture with the knight, which looks natural, because the knight must defend the a3 square. In this case, the bishop would immediately invade, check. The king cannot move to b1 because of deadly queen e5, and there is no way white can prevent the checkmate on b2. That's why, after bishop a3 check, the king must move to d1, but in this case, again, black would play queen e5. The queen will invade a1 square, and there is no way white can prevent it. White can finally finish the development of the king side, but after that black would play queen a1 check, knight b1. Now the rooks joins the attack with great effect, check. Knight must move to d2, and bishop b4. White is completely paralyzed. The knight is pinned, the second knight is also pinned, and it isn't clear how white is going to defend it, because it's attacked twice. But instead of, after rook takes d2, instead of knight takes d2, white could have played queen takes d2. But still, in this case, black would play knight g4, of course, creating 2 threats. The first, a very serious threat, bishop h6, pinning the queen and winning it, because the g4 knight controls the h6 square. And the second threat, of course, is knight f2, attacking the rook. In this case, white should have played queen a5, moving away from d2 in order to save the queen, but knight f2, attacking the rook, knight e2, finally developing the king side. After that, black would get the exchange, return the sacrificed exchange. Rook takes h1, bishop takes e4, bishop takes e4, queen takes e4, attacking the rook and the knight. White must play rook e1, and, for example, after bishop h6 check, white is 2 pawns up, but black has a very strong initiative, because black pieces are much more active than white pieces. So that's why after e4, Korchnoi didn't capture on e4. Instead, he retreats to c3. But on c3, the queen falls under the attack of the bishop. Bishop g7 with great effect. Now there is very unpleasant x-ray. Black is threatening to move away the knight with the discovered attack on the queen. Probably for white it would have been better to play queen a5, moving away from the x-ray. In this case, after rook e7, the position would be completely very complicated, and it would be almost impossible to evaluate it. Of course, the rook is standing now in front of the queen. There is no unpleasant x-ray anymore, and for the sacrificed material, black would have had a very good compensation. So the position would be very complicated. But instead of queen a5, which looked natural, Korchnoi found a very interesting, very original idea. He decided to sacrifice his queen for 2 pieces. He finally develops his kingside, knight h3. And of course, Stein immediately plays knight g4 with the discovered attack on the queen. And now it's too late to play queen a5, because black would simply capture the pawn and returning one of the sacrificed pawns, and black pieces are very active. Black has a very good position and a very big advantage. For just one pawn, black has very strong initiative. That's why now we can see Korchnoi's idea. He doesn't move his queen. Instead, first he gets the first piece for the queen, and after black captures the queen, he gets the second piece for the queen, also activating his knight, which wasn't doing anything on b1. Now it's very strong on c3. And also the black knight is under attack, so Stein must move it to f6, from which it defends the pawn, but Korchnoi kicks it out, g5. Knight must retreat, and now Korchnoi gets the third pawn. Knight takes e4. So for the queen, Korchnoi has 2 pieces and 3 pawns, which is the sufficient material equivalent. So the position is very complicated. The chaos, the total chaos reigns at the moment, and it's very difficult to find plans, logical plans in this position for both sides. So Stein, as there is very unpleasant x-ray, the knight can jump at any moment. Knight f6 check, for example, would immediately win the queen. That's why Stein plays queen f8, moving away from the x-ray and also vacating the e8 square for his rook, which isn't doing anything on b8 currently. Korchnoi plays bishop c3, moving his bishop to the long diagonal, because the dark squares on black's king side are weakened, because black doesn't have the dark squared bishop anymore to defend these squares. Rook f3 followed, attacking the bishop. Bishop, that's why, retreats to b2, and now the rook moves to e8. So Stein activates his rook, and we have reached the critical position. The move that first comes to mind, a tempting move, namely knight f6 check, doesn't work, because black would simply capture, and after g takes f, black would capture on f6 with the discovered attack on the rook, and after bishop takes f6, bishop takes h1, black is better. Probably the correct move would have been bishop d4, centralizing the bishop, taking under control the f2 square, so that the knight, which isn't doing anything on h3, can move to f2, reinforcing the central knight, and also probably from f2 the knight might jump to g4, and together with the e4 knight would create very unpleasant threats of invasion on f6. Also, the d4 bishop would have attacked the pawn and controlled the c5 square, preventing black knight from jumping to c5. But instead of this, Korchnoi, it seems that he wanted to ensure the king's safety, so he moves his king to b1. But it turned out to be a decisive mistake. And you can pause the video and try to find Stein's combination. I will give you a small tip. Take into consideration the geometry of the chessboard. By playing king b1, Korchnoi placed his king on the light square. Can black exploit this fact? Yes, black can do it, because the king is placed on the light square and the loose knight is also placed on the light square. So, by playing queen f5, black can attack both the king and the knight, if black manages to eliminate the defender of the light squares, namely the bishop on c2. And that's exactly what Stein does. He sacrifices the exchange. After bishop takes e4, the exchange sacrifice follows in order to eliminate the light squared bishop. And after rook takes e4, rook f1 check. In case white captures, after queen takes f1 check and the double attack, the knight would fall. That's why Korchnoi plays rook e1, but now queen f5 check with the double attack. The king must move, and after the exchange of the rooks, Stein captures the knight and gets the absolutely winning position. Korchnoi continues the resistance. Bishop d4, queen g2 attacking the rook, rook g1, queen d2 attacking the bishop, bishop takes a7. So Korchnoi has 3 connected passed pawns, but of course he doesn't have any chances, because Stein activates his knight, knight d3 is coming, threatening checkmate on b2, bishop c5, knight d3, threatening checkmate and attacking the bishop. That's why bishop a3 and knight b4, threatening checkmate on e2, on a2. White is forced to capture, and instead of capturing the bishop, Stein plays queen d4, much stronger move, with the double attack, after which white is losing the rook, and in this position Korchnoi finally resigned. And now I recommend watching one of the most famous games by Stein, in which he sacrifices a pawn, a piece, and eventually a queen, creating a pure masterpiece. But first, like this video and subscribe, as it's really helpful for the channel growth.